This is the Fierce Heart Alliance. Our focus is spirituality with purpose, exquisite self-care, and conscious community. Hi, I'm Summer Sophia Moon, and I've come here to heal myself and chew bubblegum. And guess what? I'm all out of bubblegum. So join me and my special guests as we share and learn how to love ourselves fiercely through self-care and explore the wisdom of the harmonic virtues. These virtues are based on the laws of the universe and channeled wisdom to cultivate more resiliency, purpose, and harmony through self-care and self-awareness. By listening, you are now a fierce heart too. Welcome to the Fierce Heart Alliance. Before I begin today's topic, I'd like to say thank you to our listeners and our subscribers. You're always welcome here. We'd like to honor the indigenous peoples whose land we reside. Thank you for showing us how to be in harmony with Mother Earth. Thank you to the ancestors and spirit guides and friends who are assisting us here today. May these words be a force for good and timelessly infused with light and held in the frequency of rose quartz to spread healing and peace in the world around us. If there's any words left unsaid, we trust in spirit to make things right and let it gently ease into our consciousness as necessary for understanding in our own time and in our own way for the highest and most benevolent outcomes for all. And so it is. Thank you. Hey Fierce Hearts, today's episode is a self-care episode, and it's between the virtues of polarity and rhythm in the harmonic virtues. And it seems very fitting to have my guest here to share her work and explain how these two virtues influence self-care. And we're going to be spending a lot of time speaking about a woman's menstrual cycle. And most of us have learned in health class or from personal experience that the menstruation occurs on a monthly cycle. We typically only think about the cycle when we're actively bleeding, but there's so much more to it than that. And my guest, Melanie Birdsong, is here to help explain her work and share her wisdom of how we can work with the rhythms of our cycles. In this episode, we will be talking about health conditions, and it is not medical advice by any means. Please speak with your doctor before making any changes to your health. This episode will be very informative to anyone, even male-identifying people, to better understand the natural cycles of the womb and cycles of seasons and cycles in life. Melanie is a somatic ritualist, menstruality mentor, blood rites medicine carrier, and passionate advocate for cyclical living and women's wellness. She supports women to reclaim their bodily autonomy and reawaken their somatic intelligence. In last week's episode, Melanie Birdsong spoke about the cycles of the seasons and how we can become more aware of our bodies and that they also have seasons. At the end of last week's episode, we touched on a big topic about menstrual shame. I shared my experience when I was growing up. I learned that it's something that I just have to deal with and that it's essentially my burden as a woman to experience. Also that I need to hide it and that it's something about it was gross and unsanitary. I had an opportunity to connect with a women's circle who offered meetings that are called red tents, which is an ancient practice of women coming together to bleed and connect with their feminine energy. Through this experience, I learned about menstrual shame and I realized just how prevalent it is in society. And it can make women feel like there's something wrong with us because of something natural that happens with our body and not to our body.
Can I say something adding on what you were just saying about menstrual shame?
Oh, sure. Yes, please. Yeah. So let's talk about the concept of menstrual shame. How about that?
Yeah, so I so appreciate what you were just saying. And I think it is, it's not a small thing, menstrual shame. It's a very large thing and representative of a bigger pattern that's been going on in terms of oppression. And I think menstrual shame, these are not my words. I cannot remember who this was. I want to say Sharon Blackie, but I'm not sure. Something about menstrual shame being a very effective tool for the oppression of women or people with wombs. And, what is that about ultimately? And what is this sort of historical fear and demonization of the menstrual cycle? You may end up editing this out, but ultimately, what is that? What that is, it is related to this feminine nature and this fact that there's something that we can't control. We can't control nature. and nature is playing itself out through women's bodies. Like that, the menstrual
Mm.
cycle is full spectrum existence. Like that is our animal nature playing out in our bodies, life force moving through us. Like you cannot control that, and it is undeniable, and it is so inherent in who we are, and it is life. Like that is what gives life. That is powerful medicine. And, this sort of gradual separation from nature that modern culture has been engaging in has, you know, I'm preaching to the choir, but it's bringing with it this loss of a sense of belonging and meaning in our lives. And I think that separating ourselves from the menstrual cycle as women and menstrual shame is also mega contributing to that dynamic. Tree Sisters, that organization you may be aware of, they speak to women as a restorer species
Mm.
and speak to, the fact that when we empower women to step into their feminine, this supports humanity's shift from a consumer species to a restorer species. So I probably actually said that wrong. They're not referring to women necessarily as a restorer species, but I think we will lead the way, and we can, by something as simple as tuning into and honoring the menstrual cycle and
Mm.
reclaiming this part of ourselves. And part of my experience in doing this was a gradual deconstruction of my socialized self, and realizing like, oh no, there's a lot going on in here with this. And so yeah, this cultural suppression of the menstrual cycle is causing harm, and continuing to suppress this sacred rhythm that's unfolding in women is also causing a significant amount of harm, not only physically, because taking birth control is basically like putting yourself in menopause, but also psycho-emotionally, because you aren't experiencing the full spectrum of what your body is naturally designed to do. And so then you're in this artificially imposed rhythm, which again is part of that separation from nature. So, anyways, if we want to put it in the words of a production oriented society, we could say that we are failing to maximize a very valuable resource in the menstrual cycle. Uh, okay, anyway, that was my rant about menstrual shame.
Oh, no, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's a really great way of putting it. And I think those are maybe the words that I was trying to express, because it is definitely a sense of shame. And I think it's just pervasive, and we just don't even realize that it's shame until we're we're shown that there's another alternative. And I think that's
Yeah.
all I knew. And then I was at the red tent, and it was just this experience of honoring your bleed time and honoring the blood and giving your blood to the earth. And
Yeah.
it was just a really beautiful way of honoring that thing that we can't control. Yeah.
Mhm. Honoring nature,
Honoring
ultimately. Yeah.
nature. Yeah.
Mhm.
We're going to get into the self-care aspect and talk about real things that we can do to connect further with our menstrual cycle. And you spoke about nutrition earlier. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what things we can do at different parts of our cycle
Mhm.
as a self-care
Yeah.
aspect?
Sure. So first, I'll caveat I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not giving any kind of medical advice,
Sure.
but
Everyone needs to do their own due diligence to see if this is right for
yeah.
them. And, that we are not medical experts. This is not a diagnosis. We're just going to put that disclaimer out there. But
Yes. Well, and I guess I would preface everything that I say by first saying that the number one thing to do to create health in the menstrual cycle is to start tuning in and
so
to become
self-awareness.
aware.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So I would say before any kind of nutritional recommendations, start with menstrual cycle awareness. And that is a practice it's basically a mindfulness practice. And so it's taking time to just note your experience every day. And, there are so many tools out there to support women in this.
Apps.
Um, you know,
Yeah.
apps, definitely lots of apps. I use an app. I use something that tracks my basal body temperature automatically and loads into an app, and I can see, exactly when I'm ovulating. But,
Even Fitbit these days has an option.
does it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have one of those, but so there's so many ways to be supported in this. And not only that, by the way, this is also really empowering women to manage contraception in a more conscious way and without
Yeah.
chemical involvement, which is I'm just so excited about. But really, menstrual cycle awareness has to be the foundation for menstrual health. And most people are very busy and they don't have time to sit down and journal 30 minutes a day about everything that's going on in their life and their menstrual cycle and how it correlates. But it can be as simple as just picking things that seem most significant to you on that day, or just pick themes and stick with them so that you can see what's happening day by day and month by month. So I often just jot down a few words about significant moods of the day. Dreams, I'll notice that I have the same dream on the same day of the cycle from month to month
Oh,
sometimes.
wow.
Or like physically what's going on. Are you bloated? Are your breasts swollen? Are you super energetic? Are you really tired? So just jotting down a few things about, a couple of key indicators is all that you need to practice menstrual cycle awareness. And I mean, I often find that people get drawn into it and, want to spend more time on it, but it, it, it just start paying attention and note your experience so that you can then compare and see the patterns. Um, so that's number one, because that also is going to give you feedback about anything that you change in your diet or your exercise regimen or your meditation or whatever. You'll be able to see the impact that that's actually having on your cycle. So the proof is in the pudding, or in the blood, perhaps. So that's number one. And this really carries through, what I was saying about building your own inner authority and trusting your own body, because every single one is unique and
Mm-hmm.
everyone's cycle is unique, and there is no one size fits all for anyone. So I think that is key to just tune in. But in a general sense, I think you at the bleed time, you are better served by essentially eating food that's pre-digested. So it's well cooked, right? It's already been fired before it goes into you, and your digestive fire has to deal with it. So I would say that's, number one, because the bleed is really such an important part of the cycle and so foundational to health throughout the cycle. And so during the bleed time, if you are making sure to hydrate well,
Mm-hmm.
and soups, having pre-cooked soups so that you don't have to be cooking while you're bleeding is a really good idea. To just cook a huge pot of soup, freeze it, or cook it a couple days in advance so that it's available to you. um, those are really important things. Avoiding things that are challenging for your body to deal with, like fats or really heavy mucousy foods like dairy, meat, um, things like that. I mean, I'm not saying don't eat meat when you bleed, but really pay attention to how much energy it takes for your body to deal with what you're putting into it. And it's not just about food, in the way that we commonly think of food. It's also about sensory impressions, because that's also something that your body has to deal with and process.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're bleeding and coming up to the bleed time, it's really important to think about what are you taking in terms of your life, like what is coming into your life. And so that could be like stimulation. So menstruation is an excellent time for a digital detox and taking a
Mm-hmm.
break from screens and just not having that constant stimulation coming at you, because your body has to deal with that. It has to digest it, even though it's not the kind of food we typically think about. It is a food. Um, And so that's bleed time, I think. Just think really nourishing, warming things. If you have pain during your bleed, sipping ginger tea can be really helpful, but
Okay.
it's also just in general really warming for the body and promote circulation, which you definitely want to support during your bleed to help everything cleanse and flow and move as it needs to.
How about
Um,
sugar?
yeah, well, I think it's a general rule all through the cycle to avoid the heavy hitters like sugar, alcohol, too much of anything,
Sure.
really. But yeah, I mean, you think about things that create inflammation. Those are the things you generally want to avoid, but you especially want to avoid them leading up to the bleed and during the bleed, because then you're not getting the benefit of the bleed so much because it's having to deal with these inflammatory triggers that are coming in, which will also increase pain if you're prone to that and probably create other symptoms or exacerbate menstrual symptoms if you have them. But it's also blocking the body from being able to devote its energy to what it's designed to do at the bleed, which is cleanse and release. And I mean, it really actually is soothing and like a reboot to the nervous system if we're able to go with the flow and relax and release and rest. Yoga nidra is a really good practice to engage in
Mm,
during menstruation.
like yin yoga?
There, yin
Is
yoga,
that different?
yes,
Okay.
it's different. Yoga nidra is basically like a guided meditation where you just lay there and
Ah,
are led,
okay.
and it
Okay.
it invokes a deeply restful state in the body.
Mm.
And this is what we're going for during the bleed: deep rest and nourishment. Yin yoga, yeah, I mean, just minimizing high impact activities. You're just thinking about the body is really doing a lot when it's bleeding, and so what can you do to support it? And like not standing on your head, because the flow is the opposite direction and you don't want to interrupt the flow. So
And it seems like once you get in tune with your cycle, you're realizing that it's not just the menstrual cycle, it's not just the menstruation part that the body's working. The body's working all throughout the entire
yeah.
cycle from beginning to end. So there's always something going on. And I bring up
Yes.
sugar because I recently had a revelation because I I don't I try not to eat very much sugar. I don't eat a whole lot of candy, but chocolate is my kryptonite. That's my weakness. And I don't typically eat it, and I try not to, like eat it all the time, but it seems like when I have my cycle, I have it programmed that I need chocolate. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there is, what is it, like magnesium or something like that,
Yeah.
that the body
Yes.
craves. So we just
Mm-hmm.
associate that with chocolate being a source of that. But the irony is that the caffeine in chocolate and also the sugar in chocolate and also the milk in chocolate are things that my body doesn't like. And so I find that I when I start my menstruation, that my cycle is light and it's got you know a, a typical flow. But then when I start eating the chocolate, because I'm like, now it's playtime, I can have my chocolate, then my cycle gets heavy. And I also noticed that
Mm.
caffeine for me really gets the circulation going, as you say, but probably to an unhealthy level. And I've been dealing with anemia, not total
Mm.
anemia, but my
Mm-hmm.
ferritin levels have been low, with a couple different blood tests. And, I'm talking with my naturopaths and I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, why are my ferritin levels low? And they're like, well, I don't know, just take an iron supplement. And I was like, no, no, no. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, like there's got to be a reason why. I mean, I'm not internally bleeding. So why are my iron stores low? And finally, with a different naturopath, she was like, okay, well, what is your cycle like? And she started asking me these questions. And so that's what really prompted me to really pay attention to the flow, the consistency, what is really happening
Mm-hmm.
cycle to cycle. And so we realized that my caffeine intake was too much. Probably need to cut down on the sugar, inflammatory things, which
Mm-hmm.
I was already doing. But like I said, when it comes to my
Mm-hmm.
cycle, I'm like, I need chocolate. So what
Yeah.
is my body really saying? what can I do instead of giving it the chocolate? Is there something else that I can do for myself? And so I've been doing that kind of work. But
Mhm.
yeah, that's why I was like, we should probably talk about chocolate and like, you know, dark chocolate as opposed to like Hershey's sort of, or like,
Yeah.
the high sugary sort of stuff. Get yourself some dark chocolate, low sugar, be
Yes.
careful about your
Yes.
chocolate and caffeine intake. I would say that would be my two like pieces of information. But
I think that's really good advice. Yeah, I think it's really good advice. And, you know, I've experienced similar things and cravings at different times in the cycle. And it's like, okay, what is this about? And for me, it's interesting to also inquire into like, what is my mental state when that's
mm,
happening? And is there something that I'm trying to avoid by, stimulating or satisfying this kind of craving? And so
am I eating
that
my
that's also
feelings?
well, yeah, to an extent, right? Because
Yeah.
it's all about energy ultimately. And so what is the energetic signature that's playing out in your cycle? And so I'm just appreciating how much you're tuned into what is happening when there are different inputs into the system and the impact that that has on your cycle. And
Thank you.
so I would just be curious, yeah, and I appreciate the second naturopath you talked to who seemed less like an allopathic naturopath and more like a traditional naturopath.
Right? It took me a couple to
Because,
work through.
yeah, well, and I so appreciate that you've been on that journey because I think so many women experience, going to a traditional Western medicine doc and just being told to medicate. And it's like,
Right.
okay, well, that's just covering up whatever is going on that is going to support you to live into greater wholeness if you can pay attention and figure out what's out of balance, right?
Yeah.
So I'm appreciating the second naturopath.
Yeah.
um, but ultimately, you know, your ability to tune into your cycle and say what is going on and to have that kind of self-knowledge, which we all have access to, but haven't all and don't all always necessarily tap into. Um,
Well, it's
so
not something
that
that society teaches us. It's something that we have to
exactly.
do, and it's not something we
Yes.
can buy. It's something that, and that's probably where your job comes in, is to like help foster that. But it is our own journey to tune in and listen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's so key, like learning to trust ourselves, learning to
Yeah.
trust the cycle and what it has to say to us. And, really being willing to examine our lives
Mhm.
and meet what is unfolding. Um, and by the way, a really good time to do that is the inner autumn when the energies are super supportive for that, but you have to be careful of the inner critic coming out, right? And
Oh,
destroying things. So, but anyway, yeah, I mean, that's the biggest thing to me. Yes, obviously, alcohol, caffeine, sugar, dairy, heavy things like fried food,
mm.
these are generally not great to have a lot of at any time, but especially not when you're bleeding. And if you can tune into the impact that those are having, I think it's very motivating to change once you can really track it and see the impact that it's having on you in your cycle in your life.
Well, are there any practices or rituals that uh, someone who's very new to this whole concept can employ to create more connection?
Yes. So the first one I would say is menstrual cycle awareness, which I've already said, but I would say it 100,000 more times if we had time to say that. Like that is the most important. And it really is, it can be a ritual in and of itself. And it's such a supportive practice and is really key to start to understand what's going on in your cycle and where your strengths and opportunities are.
Mm.
But there's plenty of other things that you can do to tune in and to support the cycle. I think creating routine is a really good way to support the cycle. So just creating more routine in your life generally. And, at a very high level, just starting to create more of a routine or schedule or sense of flow that is moving with the energy of the seasons. So just at least, at the very least, knowing when your bleed's coming, roughly when you're going to ovulate, so that you know where you are in the cycle and you know where you are energetically, so that you know what is naturally supporting you at any given time and what's coming, so you can prepare for it. So at the very least, knowing those then helps you to start to create a more cyclical way of living, so that you know, if you've just menstruated, all right, I'm going to have a period of rising energy until I ovulate roughly. And then it's going to start to decrease. And just starting to really tune into that rhythm as a foundation, even if you're not practicing menstrual cycle awareness, I think that can make a huge difference. I like to keep a seasonal altar. So changing the altar with each of the seasons, each of the inner seasons. And that can be anything as simple as, like, I have a little spot where I have a candle and I light it when the seasons change. Or it can be elaborate with, switching out the elements and the things that are meaningful to you or represent the energy of that season for you. And, you know, feeling an embodiment of the archetypal energy that you're moving into, whether that's maiden in spring, mother in summer, enchantress in autumn, or the sage in the inner winter.
Mm.
So, whatever resonates for you, but just connecting into the energetics of each season can be helpful. There are many rituals that you can do around bleed time. A simple one being like cooking nourishing foods in advance and sort of getting ready, acknowledging that there's going to be this shift energetically and a shift in consciousness, really, and that you are moving into really sacred space in the bleed time. And so ritualizing that time with, things that are supportive to you, in terms of your own self-care and your schedule and your home space. Changing your sheets, having a pair of red sheets for when you bleed and putting those on at bleed time can be really nice. It's also sort of a sign to your family members that the blood is coming and can help prepare them.
Uh-huh.
There are other things you can do in your bleeding, like collecting your blood and giving it back to the earth. And if you're using a cloth pad, you can just soak it in water and then collect your blood that way and sort of squeeze the pads out and then give the water to your plants or to the earth.
Because there's a lot of
Obvious.
nutrients in it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a natural fertilizer for your plants. You can add, especially if there's a plant you're very connected to, say you have a rose bush, you can give your blood to that, each month. That can be a really beautiful way to connect in, and also to plug into the fact that this is part of nature unfolding in your body.
Mm-hmm.
Having baths at different points in the cycle with salt or herbs that are supportive to that particular part of the cycle. I don't know, there's some really interesting rituals,
Are you
maybe
a fan
a
of
little too much.
the
What's
noni
that?
steam? Are you a fan of that?
Yoni steaming, yes. Not while you're bleeding. It's not
Okay,
good to do while
okay.
you're bleeding. But at other points in the cycle, yeah, I
Okay.
think it can be really great. I do it. And there's a lot to that in terms of what herbs you're choosing, or there can be a lot to it. But one rule of thumb that I've heard is to, like, look at what's growing around you
Mm.
and use that, assuming it's not laden with chemicals. Um, so, gather what's around you. I've heard this before, that if you have a home where you're like entering and exiting frequently and you have plants around you, you're not just in like concrete building or something, that often the plants that you need will start to grow
Oh, really?
around
Huh.
this place where you keep coming and going and your energy is moving through. So it'd be interesting to look and see
Mm.
what's around you, for yoni steaming, or maybe just inquiring about whether those herbs are particularly supportive to the menstrual cycle in some way.
And
So those are some ways.
we were talking about awareness, and I think I just wanted to talk about, we were saying that the very basics of figuring out when you're where you're at in the cycle. And on a lot of the apps, uh, and I've tried a couple in the past, but one that I'm using right now, it all you have to do is just say my cycle started today, and it'll track it for you, and it'll ask you how many days you think that your cycle is, and then it'll calculate it for you. And so you just have to say, okay, it started today, and then you just click on it saying it ended today, and it'll auto populate, and so it'll figure out, okay, your last few cycles were at this time. So it if you don't have a lot of time, because it can be a new thing for you to get into the habit of, but if at the very least you could say my cycle started on this day, and then you never have to think about it again, and then eventually build that memory muscle to keep entering the information. That's what worked for me, because it was such a new concept. It was really hard for me to just think about tuning in all the time. And the very least of what I could do is say, okay, my cycle started here and my cycle ended there. And then eventually the app could gauge approximately when my cycle would start. And it was always within a couple days. And sure
Yeah.
enough, and they would give me a notice of your cycle's going to start in 2 days. I was like, okay, that's why I'm tired. And then you start
Yeah.
to reflect and, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then you start to like connect the dots in some way. So it, coming from someone who it was like, it totally was a new world to me. Just entering in the start date of the cycle, of when my bleeding started, really helped to catalyze the whole process of diving in, tuning in, and knowing, okay, why do I feel this way? And then you can look it up in the calendar and say, oh, because I'm starting, and like later this week, I'm already shifting in. Okay, I'm in luteal. I'm kind of down regulating. Okay, I'm going to be easy on myself. And so that's the little piece that I wanted to say. That's how you can start and create that awareness. And it's a muscle. It's going to be an awareness that builds. You're not just going to be overnight of like you suddenly understand, because that's the
Oh
mystery,
yeah.
right?
Yes. Yes. And I think the cycle apps are such a useful tool. I mean, it definitely have their limitations, and you
Sure.
need to have a couple months of cycling log to start to
Yes.
get a pretty, a more accurate picture of what
Yeah.
your rhythm is. And, of course, a caution, which I'm sure they all have this disclaimer in them, that they can't predict ovulation with accuracy
Hmm.
yet. I wear a ring that automatically takes my basal body temperature and feeds into the app, because
Okay.
basal body temperature is one of the more accurate ways you can see if you've ovulated. Because
Okay.
once
Yeah.
you ovulate, your temperature goes up and stays up for the rest of the cycle.
Oh, okay.
And so you can see that pretty clearly in these apps. So that's helpful. Now, in the days leading up to ovulation, it's still not going to be able to tell you exactly when ovulation is going to happen.
Okay.
So if you're using it for contraception purposes, then there's still this amount of self inquiry and awareness that comes into play to really use these kinds of tools effectively. But yeah, I think it can be a really great tool, especially when you're starting out. And a lot of the apps have ways to log feelings, emotions, symptoms, things like that, so you can start to see those patterns as well. I'm kind of old fashioned. I like to write it on paper so I could kind of go back through and glimpse and, circle patterns and whatnot. But yeah, I think the apps are great.
Well, let's say I'm on birth control for medical reasons, or, there's a lot of different reasons why uh, birth control is chosen. And there's also a lot of reasons why, uh, you know, their, cycles don't happen, and or they can't happen, or there's been a surgery or whatnot. There's so many different reasons why there's complications in that arena. How, if that were my situation, how could I connect with my body even if I don't have that prompt for the menstruation?
Yeah. So I hear this question a lot, and it is challenging on hormonal birth control because there is no true cycle. And even though some pills or some hormonal forms of birth control have what they call breakthrough bleeds, it's not actually a bleed. It's a
Mm.
symptom of withdrawal from taking the sugar pill. And there's no reason for that to even be happening when someone is on birth control, except that when they were studying the birth control, women were more likely to adopt it if they had a fake bleed.
Mm.
So that's the only, as far as I've researched, the only reason I've seen that there's like this fake breakthrough bleed when women are on birth control, because it's actually not necessary if you're taking the pill.
Mm.
Um, or it's not serving any other purpose, you know. So anyway, that's interesting. And I guess in one way you can tune into, if you're having a breakthrough bleed, like there is a little bit of a shift, what's happening there. It's giving you a little glimpse, but it's not like a true bleed in any sense. So I think a better way to tune in cyclically is to work with the energies of the moon, and follow its waxing and waning, which is often how women's cycles are tracking if they're not interfered with, whether chemically or from artificial light. Often women will find their cycle naturally following the cycles of the moon. And so that's not going to happen if you're on hormonal birth control, but you're still affected by the energies of this waxing and waning of the moon. And so the new moon, women often experience that as a time of sort of a decreasing in energy, a downshifting, and more of like inward. And then the full moon is sort of illuminating, shining light. And it's this time of more energy, which sometimes can be overwhelming for some people if they're sensitive to it, so that you're actually more tired at full moon because it's just too much. But that can be a way to just start to tune into how is the moon impacting you in that cycle. And you can also look at the seasons of the year, obviously, but that's a longer cycle, whereas the moon is closer to the menstrual cycle, which many women track with and bleed at new moon and ovulate at full, and sometimes it flips. But that's a good way for people on birth control. And if you're just not bleeding and you're not on birth control, that can also be a good way to start paying attention to the moon. And I think traditionally moon baths were prescribed to help regulate the menstrual cycle. And even today in fertility treatment, I believe, I forget what it's called, but they have you turn on a light, leave a light on overnight for a couple nights around the time when you should be ovulating, to sort of mimic that, the light that you'd be getting from the full moon. So the moon is a really good way to start to tune into a cyclical pattern and notice the impact that it's having on you and your body. And you can track it the same way that you would do menstrual cycle awareness, this moon cycle awareness, which is also often used by women who have gone through menopause.
Well, don't they also refer to the menstrual cycle as the moon time, as a
Yes.
woman's moon time?
Yeah. And that is tied to the fact that historically women were cycling with the moon a lot more closely.
I notice that I do that sometimes. And if my cycle, because obviously the app will say, oh, you're starting in 2 days, and, 2 days go by and nothing's. And so then I look at the moon and I would see, okay, there's a new moon in about a week. I bet you she's waiting for that new moon. Sure
Mm-hmm.
enough, she's
Yeah.
waiting for that new moon. Or, okay, there's a delay. Is there someone I'm syncing with at work, or is there, okay, there's a full moon
Mm-hmm.
in a couple weeks, or, and like, later on, or I start suddenly and I'm like, oh, it's a full moon. So I do notice that. And I have been on birth control, but the funny thing is, I don't think it was a strong enough birth control that my body would say, I don't care. I'm bleeding anyways. Like, this is my agenda. And,
Yeah.
I'm not supposed to be taking it out for another couple of weeks. My body would say, nope, we're doing this. And okay. Like, so I stopped taking it. And, but yeah, that's just something that, and I love that happens. And that just
Mm-hmm.
makes me feel like I'm a part of nature. It reminds me of my, natural essence, and that we
Mm-hmm.
are connected to something bigger, and the mystery and the magic, and it just makes me feel like there's, yeah, that vibrancy and magic in life that I think it's really cool to remind yourself of.
Absolutely. I wish that for every woman, that every woman could know, really know the power and potency of the menstrual cycle and the menopausal process for that matter, but we're not getting into that.
Which, yeah, that's probably a whole other podcast because I feel
Yeah.
like, that's not very many people are talking about it. And, I'm kind of getting older and
Me too.
I'm not there yet, but I want to know what's coming. And I hear it's a total shift of hormones, and I just feel like nobody's having that discussion. So maybe another time.
Yeah. Although I will add, maybe as a teaser for that
Sure.
conversation, that there is a map of menopause that the teachers I've studied with have put forth that also traces onto the map of menstruation. And we didn't talk about this, but when you bleed, there are these distinct energetic phases that you go through. There are 5 of them.
Mm.
And my teachers call them chambers. So the 5 chambers of menstruation, which basically map onto the menopausal transition.
Oh,
It's really cool. But, the point is that, like, essentially with each bleed, we are practicing and like building this muscle to go through the menopausal transition.
oh, wow.
And I mean, ultimately to go through death, but really, this is it's no part of the life cycle is separate, right? It's all one long string.
Yeah.
And the menstrual cycle and the health of the menstrual cycle and how we relate to it really impacts how we go through the menopausal transition and the degree of ease or challenge that we may find there.
Wow. That's pretty incredible.
I know. And more, more and more of this is being talked about. So I'm excited to
Which is
see what
great.
the future
That's
holds.
probably a sign, like the shifting of the patriarchy and the
Yes.
shifting into, the balance between matriarchy, patriarchy. Yeah, that's what I
Yes.
totally see with this rise in communication and understanding. And yeah, it's quite a time. Melanie, do you have any closing words, final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Um, no, other than please do bleed if you can. And just an invitation to experience the profound beauty that is the menstrual cycle. That's all.
Oh, that's wonderful. And that's plenty.
Mhm.
That is enough. Yeah. Thank you so much, Melanie.
Yeah, thank you.
That's our episode for this week. Please like and subscribe. It helps this podcast more than you know. And you can always follow the Fierce Heart Alliance on Facebook and Instagram for weekly inspiration. Check out our website at www.fierceheartalliance.com to get your free guide to work with the harmonic virtues yourself. Next week is our charity episode with adoptclassroom.org. Take care, Fierce Hearts. Till next time.